So, like, first of all, like, can you introduce yourself for the audience?
Yeah, so I'm Gareth Sandford. I'm an international sports science consultant, and I specialize at the kind of intersection where speed meets endurance. So if you think on the kind of Olympic, Paralympic sports side, anything that's in the 1 to 10 minute type range, and then team sports, where they present with, again, huge blends within their training squads of athletes that are more speed dominant or more endurance dominant. And I'm currently based in Victoria, British Columbia, where I work with the Canadian track and field team and the triathlon team too.
Nice, nice, nice. So, like you mentioned, like team sport athlete, they usually do like MAS or ASR for their energy system programming. So, like, can you like introduce a little bit about like what is MAS and what is ASR?
Yeah, so I'd maybe zoom out and say when I think about uh, training or conditioning for team sport athletes, and let's take football or soccer as an example, there are six main qualities that I think about. So if we start with sprinting speed, we then have acceleration and deceleration. So there's three. Then we have your maximal aerobic speed, which is the highest rate of oxygen uptake, which is also a blend of aerobic and anaerobic energy systems. That's really important when it comes to the training side. It's not just the aerobic system. Then we have the critical speed, which is the highest intensity that is primarily fueled by aerobic energy system. Okay. And this is like a moderate training intensity. So if we were to anchor it in a perceived exertion or a perceived effort, it would be the 5, 6 out of 10 range. Then you have your low intensity. Where the anaerobic speed reserve comes in is it looks at the speed range or that difference in velocity from the maximal aerobic speed to the maximal sprinting speed. So when I'm looking at training or thinking about profiling an athlete in team sport, these are the variables I'm thinking about and looking at. Yeah. And you'll notice that it includes everything from speed to endurance. And I
Nice.
think that's an important message to start with, because one of the traps sometimes that we can fall into with conditioning is that we have either a very strong endurance bias or we have a very strong speed bias. And so that means that some athletes are maybe getting what they need, but there are some that are not. And we have a squad that needs everything in different blends.
Nice, nice, nice. So, um, how exactly for like team sport athlete, how to describe like team sport athlete their conditioning like using MS or ASR? How to describe their like HIIT or like conditioning work?
Hmm. Yeah, so I think for team sport practitioners, there's a big tension between things that are sport specific versus things that are specifically training physical capacities that underpin the sport. So that's where, on the conditioning side, aerobically, we want to think about both low and moderate intensity, which build our peripheral adaptations. So they build things like the capillaries, the train lines that help clear the byproducts of high intensity work and help us repeat and recover. We want to think about blending that kind of stimulus in our training on the aerobic side with occasional blocks of that more high intensity work, of which MAS is an example. The reason why we don't do MAS on its own all the time is that if you think of low and moderate intensity, like putting money in a bank account. So every time we do that work, we're building the bank account. Every time we do high intensity training, or we play a game, or we travel, or we do something like that, we're making withdrawals. And so if we're only doing high intensity training to build aerobic fitness, we run into a situation very quickly where we've got a quick boost after maybe 4 or 5 weeks. But then we go, well, where do we go now? right? Because the VO2 max and that maximal capacity is not the limiting factor to our athletes' conditioning right now. It's probably raising the percentage of that VO2 max that the critical speed can move into, which comes from your low and moderate training intensity. And so this is one of the big gaps I observe in conditioning in team sport generally, because it's hard to achieve those things through small-sided games, because often what you need is you need an accumulation of time. You need 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes continuous to stimulate those peripheral adaptations. And so what I encourage practitioners to think about is in their week, where are there opportunities where they can sneak these things in on the bike or after a training session, or use bikes as top-ups, because it's very hard in drills that have a lot of variability in the stimulus experience by each player to accumulate enough time in the moderate intensity. I have colleagues who work in clubs where they've tried with drills, and in an 8-minute drill, Eric, how long do you think they accumulated time at moderate intensity? An 8-minute drill that's targeting moderate intensity, how many minutes do you think they achieved?
4 or 5.
Only like 1.5 minutes. Because you have, in like a passing drill, even in big spaces, you have some players working, others not working, right? For some, it's too hard. For others, it's not hard enough. And so we can try to do these things through drills, but what we get is variability. And so that's not a bang for buck solution for coaches that don't have much time. And so I recommend, let's do 20 to 30 minutes on a bike where we can be confident that we've achieved that stimulus. And then we can really use that small-sided game of things to really target the sport-specific tactical, technical demands. But that aerobic-based conditioning probably needs to come somewhere else. So that's the aerobic side of the table. Would you like me to move on to the other side?
Yeah.
Yeah. So with the other side of conditioning, the sprinting speed, acceleration, deceleration, I think these are the on-pitch focused conditioning items that can be achieved, for example, at the end of a warm-up in preparation for a main training session. And honestly, I think with the high intensity work that happens above MAS, I think we have to be looking at what is our daily training giving us. Because often, just by playing the game, we're getting lots of exposures to the work beyond max aerobic speed in terms of intensity. And so that poses the question of, do we need as much high intensity in our conditioning as we maybe think we do? And the answer may be, if you're someone who's got, 3 or 4 people who are substitutes every week and they're not getting the game exposure, then yes, maybe they're people that need a lot of those top-ups of that sport-specific work. But those people who are playing 90 minutes, let's say in, 2 to 3 times a week, they're people where you want to be filling the bank account and being really deliberate and really careful when you want to make those withdrawals. That would be a summary of how I think about that work above MAS. And that's also to separate things like speed endurance, which have, a much more anaerobic, glycolytic, high lactate energy system focus, from acceleration, deceleration, and sprinting, where these are more limited by technique and force expression. Okay, so think of the weight room, think of, physio, screening, movement patterns, those kind of elements. So when we break those things apart, we maybe spend less money in that anaerobic energy system space, because you get those adaptations very quickly. And so if you're playing the game and you're doing that, then you're probably getting plenty of that stimulus. we want to check, we want to be sure, but it's the other elements that hold the scaffolding in conditioning to really realizing higher volumes of that sport specific work, and also being able to be on at the right time of the season. Yeah.
Love it. Sorry, love this. I love this. So, what are your thoughts on like a few years ago? Probably there's still some coaches gonna do this right now. I'm not gonna say it's wrong, but when it comes to like conditioning, like we often have the image that for athletes it's gonna be high intensity. If we do like low to moderate intensity, that's gonna hurt their performance. What are your thoughts on like these kind of like discussion?
What would you say are the main reasons people suggest it's hurting the performance? What have you experienced?
Like like mainly like power output. There's it's gonna hurt their like yeah, peak power,
Yeah,
like peak force.
right. That it might make them slow, for example. Yeah, yeah. So um I work with 800-meter running, which the time duration of that event is all out for 100 seconds, right? 100 seconds to 2 minutes. And those are athletes that need extremely high levels of speed and extremely high levels of endurance. And they need them both at the same time, and they need to have them at their maximum when it comes to competition. And so these are people that their mileage per week in terms of training volume will range anywhere from 40 kilometers a week all the way to 140 kilometers a week. And even the people who are at that over 100 kilometers a week can still develop, hold on to, and improve sprinting speed with that kind of volume, right? So I think there's an element of we're not exposed often to athletes that actually do maximize both ends of the continuum. And so that creates this prevailing myth that if you're developing one, you can't develop the other. Now, there is going to be times where you want to focus on one a bit more than the other. So I think of it like spinning plates, right? What happens if you're spinning a plate but you stop applying a twist to the rod? The plate falls down, right? And it's the same with training. Even if we're saying, okay, for the next 6 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks, we want to focus on building aerobically, that doesn't mean that we're not spinning the plate of speed at all. We're doing enough to keep it going, and we develop bandwidths of where we're comfortable of that speed dropping to, because we're focusing more on spinning the aerobic side faster, but we're not letting it fall. And so that's the dance that people are doing every week, right? And part one of being able to do that is having a model where you're looking for all of those items we talked about just at the beginning every week and going, okay, are we building or are we maintaining this quality this week?
Nice.
And yeah, and thinking about it that way. And there's also the side of things where, are we developing it out on the pitch? Are we developing it out on the weight room? Because if we're talking about those, acceleration, deceleration, sprinting speed elements, it might be that for an endurance type individual who's never been exposed to sprinting speed, they have a lot of headroom in just having better range of motion, being able to express more force. And so what improving speed might be for that athlete might be go and spend some time in the weight room. We might touch on it on the pitch, but the emphasis on the pitch is not to be maximizing that quality yet, because we're tackling that elsewhere. So I think really looking in and out of all the disciplines about where are we tackling these areas, you can scaffold those qualities together.
Nice. So next, I'm gonna ask. I probably should start with this one, but um, how can we like, how are those like tests you recommended for like MAS,
Mm.
and how to like after you have the MAS, how to
Yeah.
describe the MAS and ASR for athlete.
Can you maybe just repeat the question because your camera froze
Oh,
halfway through?
sorry.
Yeah.
So, can you recommend some tests for coaches um, to have a clue on their athletes like MAS? And after they have the MAS, um, how to like combine it with like top speed to describe like MAS and ASR? Can you like give us some
Yeah.
examples?
Yeah. So let me start here with testing. The first thing I'm trying to do is really better understand the type of individual I have in front of me. Because one of the things that I've experienced a lot across team sports is that there's a huge range of athlete physiology in the group. You have athletes who are maybe more fast twitch and speed oriented. You have some athletes that are more endurance oriented, and their role in the team is different. You know, when we think of Arsenal, right? Arsenal Football Club, like Declan Rice's role is not the same as Bukayo Saka, right? They have different gifts they're bringing to the team. But when we're in a training model, if our training model is training everyone the same, then do we ever maximize those individual qualities that that person has to maximize what they're going to bring to the team? So the first part of testing for me is understanding those differences. So the sprinting speed test, I use a standing 50-meter effort. And that gives me the maximal ceiling of their force expression and speed, okay, which we know is limited by force. And then I look at that compared to their maximal aerobic speed, and then I estimate critical speed from there. So I'll explain those two things right now. So the maximal aerobic speed, I use a 6-minute time trial. The reason I use 6 minutes is that you can sustain VO2 max for about that duration of time, okay? Some of these other tests, like a yo-yo or a 30-15 or these other tests, they involve a number of other elements, such as change of direction, such as rest periods. And the physiology of people's recovery between those rest periods or their ability to accelerate and decelerate is different. And so what that gives you is it gives you more variability of the result, right? It gives you more variability. Did they get fitter because they have better change of direction? Like, did they get an improved score because they have better change of direction? Or because they recovered faster between reps? Or did their VO2 max improve? It's very hard to answer that question from those intermittent tests. So the 6-minute continuous run, we can be pretty confident what that's telling us. We can be pretty confident that's telling us about their VO2 max type physiology. Something that's shorter than that, like a 3-minute or something like that, it allows people who are more anaerobically driven to maybe grind a little bit and still get a good score, right? But once you build that length out to 6 minutes, you cannot cheat that, right? You cannot cheat that test. And a couple of tips for executing this test is you will have a rough idea in your squad who's at the fitter end and who is maybe further down the group. And I would split the group into 3. Or think about the sizing of your group, maybe a maximum of 6 per group, and set them off at a different pace, a different starting pace. And just make sure at the beginning they don't hugely overshoot or undershoot. That means that at the end, you get a score that's very representative of their current fitness. And so that's where I would start. So you've got your MAS now, and you've got your sprinting speed, and you'll be able to line those up across your squad, and you'll see big differences between your athletes. From the MAS, you can then estimate where your moderate intensity training pace should be. Now, that typically in highly trained endurance athletes like middle distance runners, marathoners, that could reach somewhere as high as like 95% of their MAS. So if your MAS is, I'm going to do some rough math off the top of my head here, but if your MAS, let's say, is 20 kilometers an hour, which would be 3 minutes a K plus or minus, then you'd be expecting people's critical speed to be able to get into the 17 to 18 kilometers an hour. Why does that matter? Well, that means that any distance under that critical speed that you cover will be physiologically easy for the team. But a lot of what I see at the moment is this is a stimulus not even being trained by most people. So what does that tell us? That tells us a couple of things. Number one, there is a massive performance opportunity on the table that is being left on the table. And number two, when we look at the balance of the types of athletes in our squad, the endurance type athletes in the group, so these are your people like your Bernardo Silvas and your Declan Rices that are going to be covering the 13, 14 kilometers a game in football, for example. These are people that thrive off the aerobic system. So to maximize that aerobic system, they really lean on the moderate low intensity work with sprinkles of that high intensity. And so if we're not targeting that stimulus with those type of athletes, there's so much headroom in their conditioning on the table that we're just not tapping into. So that's how I think about that package. For team sports with critical speed, your starting pace is probably somewhere around that 80% of critical speed if you've not started before. So step one is to do the MAS, calculate 80% as a speed, and then take that speed and go, okay, let's do a run at that pace. And let's see what the response is. And what we're looking for is we're looking for a perceived effort of 5 or 6 out of 10. If that perceived effort starts to become 7 or 8, we're now working too hard. Our breathing should be long and deep, but not hyperventilating, okay? When we finish, we should be able to talk. If we can't talk to our trainer, we're working too hard, okay? Other things that you can use, if you use heart rate belts, you would be in the training zone of somewhere in the 82 to 87% of your max heart rate. And if you have the capacity to measure blood, you'd be looking for a blood lactate measure in the 3 to 3.5 millimole range. And so that's where, because you're in steady state physiology, if we want an adaptation here, we have to accumulate time. And so back to your question of how we use the tests in training, trying to apply this in small-sided games or tactical technical games doesn't actually give you enough stimulus to develop adaptation in these qualities. So that's where we have to have a real conversation about, okay, so now how are we maximizing the physiology of the endurance and hybrid, particularly those types of athletes in our squad? You know, 90% of our squad is not Kylian Mbappe. They don't have that explosive, fast twitch physiology. And so that means to maximize those athletes, the lower moderate, the building the bank account is really how those people get to their best performance.
Nice. So, besides like using these tests to like get the VO2 max or like having a exact number on their like energy system conditioning, is there like, besides like MAS or ASR, is there other way to like analyze the need for the speed, the need for the sport and do the same thing like conditioning our athletes?
Yeah, I think because the tactical component is so key for dictating the demands of the game, I think we want to understand what the demands are under different types of scenarios. If we're playing a team that's very high press or not very high press, you know, if we're ahead in a game versus behind in a game. I also think we want to be careful around how we're actually quantifying what the demands of the game are. Because there's the good paper came out recently that looked at, okay, how do the high speed distances covered and the total volumes compare when the ball's out of play versus in play, because most analysis often is focused just the total. And there's a considerable change, particularly in the high speed distance and the rates per minute and these kind of elements when we look at the ball in play versus out of play in the combined. And so I think we just want to maybe dive deeper in the questions we ask and the categories we are determining the demands for. Because, for example, if we've got speed type athletes and endurance type athletes in the same squad, often we will go, oh, fullbacks should do this, for example, or centre midfielders should do this. And I would say, well, which type of profile are we talking about? Are we talking about a speed athlete or an endurance athlete or a hybrid athlete? Because you might have one of each in one position. And so, yes, for the tactical, technical side of training, we absolutely want to be on the same page about what the coach is requesting of an athlete. But then when we come to deploying the training stimulus, we want to understand, okay, well, how's this person going to respond versus this person, because it's not the same. Yeah.
I love this. I love this. So, what are your thoughts on like because you work with like the track and field team right now. So what are your thoughts on like, let's say like for 100-meter sprinter, their conditioning work, like the traditional tempo run, like 100-meter, like probably uh 3 sets of 4, or like 200 meters, like 300 meters runs for like 100-meter sprinters.
Yeah. So some of the great work from Peter Weyand looked at the determinants of performance across all out durations up to 60 seconds. So if we're talking about track and field, that would approximately be 400 meters or 400 hurdles or slower, or shorter distances. And what he found was all out efforts under 60 seconds are primarily limited by ground reaction forces. And so to me, in 100-meter sprinters, I wouldn't really be doing much of that work at all, because the event is primarily limited by force. So beyond just general fitness and health, and having enough fitness and health that enables recovery and capacity to do just general work, I wouldn't be over-indexing on those items. But if we step between team sport and track and field here, in speed-based individuals, in a sport that requires aerobic qualities too, I would absolutely go this type of route, the interval-based approach, because one of the things that speed-based athletes really struggle with is that anything continuous becomes very anaerobic very quickly. I mean, have you ever seen a sprinter jog? Right? It's kind of horrible, right? They don't enjoy it. Perceived effort's really high. Lactate's really high. Breathing's high. It's uncomfortable. Risk of injury is probably a little bit higher because they don't always have the biomechanical patterns to know how to run slow, right? And so with all of that in mind, anything that's continuous can get us into trouble quite quickly. So with anything that's aerobic based, let's say we were trying to target moderate intensity. You know, someone's listening to the first half of this going, hey, I want to try some critical speed. What would I do? With a speed-based type athlete, I think about doing 1 minute repetitions at that 5 to 6 out of 10 effort. And it doesn't feel a lot after 1. But once you get to 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 to 14, that's where the work is. That's where the stimulus and the adaptation is. And in these speed-based individuals, in order to recruit those fast twitch units of muscle, you actually have to apply a bit more intensity than the slow twitch muscle to actually get some adaptation. So by raising the intensity slightly, like the tempo runs you're talking about would do, you engage more of the fast twitch muscle and actually give it a chance to adapt aerobically. Now, in speed-based individuals in a team sport, you want that adaptation because that's part of their ability to repeat and recover. You don't necessarily want that to the same, you don't want that in a sprinter, right? And so that's the balance.
Cool. So,
Yeah.
why don't like coaches in team sport just like utilize the tempo run for their conditioning work?
Did you say why do they?
Why don't we just utilize the tempo run?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question. I think there's cultural norms and within every sport of there are certain ways we do things, or I think at the moment there's a big tension for things to be more sport specific. And of course, that absolutely is important. But we do also have to have a clear conversation about specific physical capacities that underpin the sport demands, because high intensity all the time is not going to get you there. And I've spoken to many practitioners working in clubs, different team sports around the world, and year on year, they're not seeing their athletes really move on in physical conditioning on the aerobic side. That's a real problem. That's a real problem, because if the coach comes in and wants a high intensity, high pressing program, I've worked with people where club can do it on a Saturday, but then they got to come back on Tuesday and do it again. And then again the next, and they can't do that. And so we have to really square this circle and ask, like, is the repeated high intensity request that's often coming actually able to be achieved through high intensity only? Maybe you get some of the way there with speed-based individuals who are more glycolytic in nature and they're more comfortable in that repeated sprint space. With your aerobic individuals, it will just flatten them. Intensity fries them, because when you dig down to their physiology makeup, slow twitch muscle has much more aerobic enzymes and muscle machinery to deliver and utilize oxygen. They do not have a preference for everything being really high lactate. That's not how they're wired. That's not how they're set up. But we're forcing people to do that through a high intensity conditioning model. And so that's where, we have to have a real good look at this and maybe look back to, well, what's actually fueling performance? Again, to Peter Weyand's work, the mechanics, the acceleration, the deceleration, are we maximizing those qualities? Are we maximizing the sprinting speed? Because what we do know from the limited work on repeated sprint performance in the anaerobic speed reserve is that if athletes are working at a lower percentage of their reserve, so a lower percentage of that speed range from the MAS to the sprinting speed, they have a larger capacity to repeat and recover those high speed running efforts.
Nice.
So there are many items underpinning those qualities, right? There's the size of the speed reserve, making sure we're optimizing the sprinting speed and then pushing the MAS up. It's thinking about, okay, between the repeated efforts, can we recover aerobically, right? So that's your low, moderate stuff, right? And then you've got the change of direction, which is your acceleration, deceleration. So as we outlined at the beginning, that menu item, that's 90% of what you need to be thinking about. Are we maximizing the ceiling of those qualities? Because when it comes to the specific work, we have to do all that with the ball and with tactical instructions. And building your bank account in each of these areas enables you over time to do larger and larger volumes of sport-specific work, which is ultimately what we want. But we can't get there by just doing larger and larger volumes of sport-specific work. That's like saying, we're going to run the 400, Eric, right? And you're going to do it, Eric, by just running 400 meters all out every day, right? That's all you're going to do. That's going to be your training. That's how you're going to improve your 400. Whereas Eric, I'm going I'm going to work on my sprinting ceiling, and I'm going to do some tempo runs, and I'm going to work on all these other qualities. Who do you think has the better chance in the long run of maximizing their 400?
Of course, you.
Right. And that's where we end up. That's when we end up. And so, again, I'm not saying this is an either or, it's absolutely not. But in order to maximize the overall performance, we have to be consistently looking at what is the limiting factor. And when, we've got the Women's World Cup starting imminently, they're going to be playing, 8 games in a very short succession of time. Can we back it up? You have to be at your best at the end. What gets you there, right? We need a bank account. We need those physical capacities ready to come into this large now volume of specific work.
Man, I enjoy this. I enjoy this. So, um, like we discussed earlier, like those tempo run for like 100-meter sprinter, like 200-meter sprinter, for like conditioning for like elite sprinter. I know the answer is it depends, but can you like give us some like example or some clue about like if you're gonna like condition the 100-meter sprinter or like 200-meter sprinter, what would you like? What would you do?
Yeah, so I work a lot with the 400 meters. And so they're more likely to do a higher volume of these tempo type efforts. I would think about circuits off short rest if we're talking about general preparation phase. But that's not at the expense of, hills focusing on maximum acceleration, preparing us, for example, for what's coming, which will be block starts and getting ready for indoors season, right? And so with the 100, 200 meter guys, like I'm not thinking all that much, honestly, about aerobic work because that's not a limiting factor to the performance. There might be, a couple of gym circuits we're doing a week, maybe with, some 150s, but they're very easy and very relaxed in the tempo type format you're talking about. But honestly, I wouldn't go too far down that rabbit hole because that's not the thing that limits their performance. The thing that limits their performance primarily is their technique and how they're applying force on the ground. And so we really want to unpack both of those layers. So on the technical side, are we limited by stride frequency or length? Are we over-indexing on one or the other? Is everything firing in sequence? Are we limited by range of motion? Can we even get in the technical positions that our coaches are asking us to, or are we restricted by either range of motion or muscle firing? Right? Those are multidisciplinary answers, but we want to check those things out. And then on the strength side, when we hit the ground, are we limited by the maximum of force we can generate or how quickly we can generate it? And when we hit the ground, are we hitting it with a stiff, crisp contact, like a hammer striking a nail? Or are we like jelly when we hit the floor? Right? And so those are the areas that I would be focusing on and really honing in that technical model. Yes, we want enough of a general fitness, but I wouldn't go too far down the rabbit hole of full-blown aerobic conditioning with sprinters.
Nice. Last question before I let you go, okay?
Yeah, for sure.
So, I know for like basketball, they have like crazy schedules, so
Yeah,
they're not gonna need much of the energy system work for their starting players. They probably need more for their like bench player to top up. But for like American football, they play one game per week. So would you like do some conditioning work for these type of player?
when you say energy system work, what do you mean?
Like middle to low intensity work?
Yeah, so remember the bank account analogy we talked about? One of the things that team sport athletes run into, and let's take the basketball example, as you alluded to, is the fixture congestion. So what you really can't do as physical preparation staff is keep loading up on intensity. But what you can do is do low and moderate intensity work. And I probably do it off feet, right? Because you can continue filling the bank account as you go through these periods, and that's how you stay fit long into the season. So that's how I would deploy it there. With American football, because it's much more stop-start, there's probably a lot more where it is technically and maximal force expression limited. But again, there's probably a positional nuance to that. And so again, I think when we talk about, well, what are the demands, I think you want to go deeper. Which type of player with which type of physiology and which position, and what's the coach asking them to do? And how many times a week are they being asked to do that? And all of that relative to the athlete goal, right? And then together you can start to weave together your answer of how you approach that.
Nice. So for those who are interested in what we're talking about today, like where can they reach out to you?
Yeah, Twitter's probably the best place. Gareth_Sandford. Yep.
Nice. Appreciate that, man.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.